Hi, welcome to lecture 2A, and we're going to be doing an examination focus where we're going to try and apply the knowledge from lecture 2, which we looked at obedience and Milgram's work and our two other key studies, to key examination questions. So let's look at the first question. A researcher investigated obedience. The table shows a percentage of people who obeyed a simple request from a confederate who was either smartly dressed or casually dressed. So, for example, the request was to pick up some litter, and they found that those who were smartly dressed had 80% for those who actually picked it up, and only 61%. So, generally, we can see that the requests were more when somebody was smartly dressed compared to when they were casually dressed. However, it was actually the same amount whether they were smartly or casually dressed. So what did the results suggest about obedience? So the whole thing is, it suggests that people are, so don't just put 80% picked up litter compared to only 61%. That's not really what it suggests. That's just giving us the key findings, which is already on the table. So you kind of need to draw out what it's suggesting. So it's basically suggesting that people are more likely to obey people, to obey other people who are smartly dressed rather than if they were dressed casually. And what we can also say is that if the request is quite trivial, for example, just to pick up letters or do something like posting a letter. So if the request is quite trivial, then we're more likely to obey somebody who's quite smartly dressed. However, when the requests are quite hard, so in terms of physical, so carrying a heavy box up the stairs, where we don't really discriminate whether someone's smartly dressed or casually dressed, because we actually have to do a lot more work in that. So it's all about drawing out what people are most likely to do based on these particular results, and that should be enough to give you the 4 marks. Some psychologists criticize Milgram's research into obedience to authority in terms of both methodological issues and ethical issues. Explain 2 criticisms of Milgram's research and limitations. So we could focus on ethical issues. So we could talk about it may have caused the participants psychological harm simply because the participants believe that they were actually giving electric shocks to the learner, and that caused them some kind of stress. So that will be enough for 3 marks. So state what the criticism is and explain why it's a criticism. Criticism 2 could be like deception. So you don't actually have to talk about one. You don't have to talk about one methodological and one ethical. You can talk about 2 ethical if you want to, because it just says explain 2 criticisms. So we can talk about deception, that they were told that the experiment was about the punishment and learning, but it was actually about to see how far people go up to obey an authority figure in terms of releasing electric shocks. Or another methodological issue we talk about, it was done in a laboratory at Yale University, so it's quite artificial and it does not replicate real life. Yeah, so whichever one you do will be absolutely fine as long as you state it and then try and explain it in the context of Milgram's research. So when you are a passenger on a train, you are much more likely to move to another seat if the ticket collector tells you to move than if another passenger tells you to do. Use your knowledge of why people obey to explain this behavior. So the whole why people obey, that is explanations of obedience. So we can use perceived legitimate authority. Yeah, and you explain because people see the train ticket collector as somebody who has some kind of status simply because he has the uniform and he has maybe a ticket machine, and people know that he has the power to tell people to come off the train. So therefore people are more likely to obey his behavior than a passenger who has none of this. He doesn't have a uniform. They don't feel he has any authority to tell them what to do on a train. Yeah, so make sure you state what explanations of perceived legitimate authority or legitimate authority, and explain this in terms of them wearing a uniform, their status, etc. And that should be enough for your 4 marks. The following results are percentages of participants who gave the maximum shock in variations of Milgram's experiment into obedience to authority. So, why did these results suggest? What did these results suggest about the power of the Confederates in variations of Milgram's study? So it's for 4 marks. So you have at least 4 different bits of information. Now remember, you're not just stating, oh, 92.5% blah blah blah, experiment and two. Yeah, you're not supposed to state what's there. You're supposed to say draw out what it suggests. So I would say for the first one, it suggests that when we have more than um, when we have more than two, when we have more people who are obedient, we are more likely to also obey. So obedience levels will increase. Or we can draw out that when our authority figure is in the same room as us, people again are most likely to obey. Or when our authority figure is distanced away from us or not with us in any way, we're more likely to resist pressures to obey. Yeah, so this is a draw out kind of like what it shows about human nature and what we're more likely to do based on these variation findings. Explain one or more reasons why people obey authority. So how many reasons do we have? We have two explanations, or two to three. So we have gradual commitment. So you explain what gradual commitment is. You give examples and you talk about it in line of Milgram study about the voltage machine going up in 15 volts each time. And you talk about another explanation. So explain one or more reasons. So another reason could be legitimate authority in terms of status and having perceived perception that that person has authority over you. And you could talk about it in lines of Milgram study. So how the researcher had a white coat in Yale University, so you felt they felt that person had status and they knew exactly what they were doing, hence why they carried on with the experiment. Yeah, so two would be absolutely fine for the 6 marker. So you give what their explanation is, give an example, and you explain it in context of Milgram study, and that should be enough for your 6 mark here. Describe two ethical issues that can be illustrated by Milgram's research into obedience to authority. I think we covered this a bit earlier. The two ethical issues could be deception and could be psychological harm. So you state it and explain it in context of Milgram study. So deception, because they were told that the study was on the effects of punishment on learning, where it was actually to see if people would obey an authority figure in a white coat and hurt other people. And then the second one, obviously, psychological harm, because they believed and they felt they were actually causing some kind of harm to the participants, which may have stressed out the participants. Okay, so this essay I've written for you in lecture 4C, and again, it looks at outlining and evaluating one or more explanations. So how we have like two explanations in our bank anyway. So we outline, for example, gradual commitment, give an example, outline legitimate authority, give an example, and then for evaluation, we can use Milgram study to support each of these explanations. Like Milgram study, for example, supports the explanations of gradual commitment as because they were only going in the increments of 15 volts, they felt committed, etc. So you see how this essay is written in lecture 4C. In hospital, you are likely to obey a nurse. However, if you meet her outside the hospital, for example, in a shop, you are much less likely to obey. Using your knowledge of how people resist pressures to obey, explain why you are less likely to obey the nurse outside the hospital. More or less is the whole thing about the power of the uniform and seeing a nurse as a legitimate authority figure inside the hospital because she's wearing a uniform, but outside she's not wearing a uniform, so therefore you don't associate it with any authority figure. So that's the end of lecture 2A. Our next lecture we're going to be looking at resisting resisting conformity or obedience / independent behavior.